Welcome to the workshop. Recently I managed to find this beautiful die filer. They are quite rare in my region since they are no longer produced, and this one is quite grimy. So let's just get started and make it work again. I first started by vacuum out the bottom of the machine. Next I unhooked the drive chain and removed the motor from its swing. Removing the bolt of the swing took a little bit of convincing since it probably didn't move since 1965 when this machine was built. But after some hammering I managed to get it loose. Now onto the main work area of the filer. I pulled off all the hold down elements that prevent the workpiece from lifting. I also removed the swing arms. They were beautiful cast pieces, but they're really stuck. I also removed the saw blade holder from the swing arm. The second post required a little bit more effort to get loose, but with a hammer it got out quite nicely. Getting the table loose required a little bit of effort because the clamp itself was stuck, but again, using the wood block and a hammer I got it loose in a reasonable amount of time. The only problem was lifting it off. The handle of the table was also broken off during transport, but I think we can do better with an aluminium one anyway, so I'm going to replace it after I manage to get it out. Removing the table was a bit hard as it was stuck and my brother helped me lifting it off screen. I also am planning to replace all the wiring. So I first unscrewed the plate with the switch on and then disassembled all the wiring inside of the machine. All the round parts I managed to clean up really nicely on the lathe with some abrasive felt, and the little parts got a nice bath in some warm soapy water. Please ignore the flash rusting of the lift dial. It's the only part who did that, and I think it's from a different material than the other parts. The motor swing plate was crusty, but cleaning it up was really satisfying when I used a scrape on it. Now onto the main table. The table has two rotational axes for tilting the workpiece. And the first axis is really easy to disassemble because I can just remove this plate and unscrew the hinge, and then I can just pull it off. The second one is a bit more complicated because it has two pressed in pins that act as the hinge of the mechanism. When I tried to remove them, they were quite stubborn, but in the end they just flew right out. The surface of the table was quite grimy, but using just a little bit of degreaser and a Scotch-Brite, I was able to clean it up wonderfully, and the side-by-side comparison of it being dirty is quite astonishing. There were still some of the original fly cutting marks, so I'm quite confident that it is quite flat still. We can now start with putting it all back together, and the first step is to add back the rack where the pinion moves on, and I added a lot of lube to prevent the parts from rusting. And after hammering the pins back in, I can now put the rack back together. The angle of the table is controlled with one rack and pinion, providing a reduction to increase the precision, and an additional nut is there to lock it in place. The second angle is controlled in the same way, only that the whole mechanism is put together and held together with the top plate and not a pin as the hinge. Now with the table finished, I can move back to the machine and mount it back onto the die filer. Took me a little bit to get it in, but it worked out flawlessly afterwards. I then put back the motor swing, and this time the pin went in quite easily, and only after a little bit of hammering I could move on to screw in the bolt to tighten the chain. The motor also got new wires, and after connecting them in a star configuration, I closed off the housing. I added back the fan and I screwed on the watertight seal, and then mounted the motor back and made sure that the chain and the motor are in line so that they don't slip off. Now onto the electronics. The whole machine is really simple and it only has one 3-phase power switch that controls the whole movement, and there's also only one motor in this machine, so it's really simple and the intelligence just comes from the mechanics inside. I also swapped out the old wires for some new wires because the old insulation was really brittle and I don't trust them anymore. So I first removed the insulation and then crimped on the connector. All of it was then tucked back behind the switch. Next I returned the dial that controls how much the machine lifts its head, and it sits on the same shaft as the output of the machine. The dial is fixed in place by the thrust bearing and the nut that sits on top. Now we can finish up the bottom part of the machine, return the covers and also screw back on the nameplate of the machine. After finishing up the bottom of the machine, we can now focus back on the main plate and add back the hold down posts, add back the machine stops, and also add back the swing arms with the little hold down fingers. I then add back the file holder with its nice indexing plate to locate it quickly if I, for example, want to switch to tooling or something like that. For the last thing that needs to be fixed on this machine, we have to repair the hand dial to raise the table back up. And since it was just a plastic part, I'm going to rebuild it in aluminium. And I start with at first drilling out one of my aluminium blanks that is going to become the clamp that mounts to the shaft and the middle piece between the hand wheel and the shaft itself. I also turned a little stand off so it doesn't rub against the casting of the machine. And after testing for the fit, I then can move on onto the milling machine. I drilled 2 holes for some clamping screws. Then I cut the slit to make the clamp compliant and make sure to rub against the surface with the slitting saw auger to ruin the finish. I then used an end mill to counterbore for the screw heads, and afterwards I drilled to create clearance for the shaft of the screw. Back on the lathe I used the shaft as an arbor to finish up the backside of the clamp, and after burning it down to length I headed back to the mill to add 2 mounting screws for the actual hand wheel. I did use a V-block to make sure that everything is square and mounts nicely in the vise. And later on I also tapped those holes to accept some screws. The hand wheel gets made from a leftover wheel my dad made years ago, and I turned it to shape while mounted on the clamp to make sure it runs through with the shaft. I also added some nice chamfers to prevent me from cutting myself and to make it look a little bit more professional. Just a blob of grease later and it slid into place easily, and it actually works great. Like, lifting the table is still a little bit hard because of the weight, but it works really great now. Now that the last part has been repaired, we can now finally start trying it out and see if it actually moves. And of course it does. These old machines usually are nearly indestructible because they're just built a little bit more heavy than the modern machines. And for just a little bit of love and care you can get something really great. Now, restoring this machine took me about a week and I can't wait to use it in the workshop. I currently plan to add a little bit of tooling to use it as a gear shaper, and I will require to build a lot of tooling for that, to add motors and the gear cutter. But I look forward to that, and I hope I get a lot of use out of this machine because it already gives me so much joy to work on it. So have a nice day, and I see you all next time. Bye bye.